He was the most feared man in the city, a crime lord who built an empire on silence and power. But when he saw her standing in that hospital corridor, 6 months pregnant with the twins he never knew existed, every wall he'd ever built came crashing down. He'd left her for another woman, abandoned their marriage like it was just another business deal. But now, staring at the curve of her belly, at the life growing inside her, he realizes he didn't just lose a wife, he lost everything that could have saved him. This is the story of a man who had it all and threw away the only thing that mattered. And now? Now he'll have to fight not for power, but for the chance to be the father his sons deserve. Hit subscribe. We're building something different here, and I need your help to reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's grow together. He didn't go to hospitals unless someone was dying. Jae-won stood in the sterile white corridor, hands in the pockets of his black coat, watching his underboss disappear behind double doors. A routine check. Nothing critical. He'd wait 10 minutes, then leave. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear, two things he associated with weakness. He hated it here. His phone buzzed. A message from her. The woman who now wore his ring. The woman who slept in the bed that used to belong to someone else. Dinner at 8. Don't be late. He didn't reply. Instead, he turned toward the elevator, ready to leave this place behind. But then he saw her. At first, it was just a silhouette. A woman walking slowly down the hall, one hand resting on her lower back, the other cradling something round and full beneath a soft cream sweater. His breath stopped. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Even now, even like this. But because he knew that walk. The way her shoulders curved slightly forward when she was tired. The way her fingers absently touched her collarbone when she was thinking. He knew her. Sumin, his wife. No, his ex-wife. The woman he'd left 8 months ago. She hadn't seen him yet. She was looking down at a paper in her hand, her lips moving silently as she read. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in a loose braid. She looked softer, rounder, pregnant. The word hit him like a bullet he didn't see coming. She was pregnant. Very pregnant. Jae-won's mind scrambled to do the math, his pulse hammering in his ears. 8 months since he'd left, which meant, 6 months pregnant. Maybe 7. Which meant she'd been carrying his child when he walked out. When he told her he didn't love her anymore. When he said he was marrying someone else. When he watched her sign the divorce papers with shaking hands and didn't say a single word to stop her. She'd been pregnant, and she never told him. His chest felt like it was caving in. Sumin stopped walking. She shifted her weight, wincing slightly, then placed both hands on her belly. The movement was so tender, so protective, that something inside him cracked. He should walk away. He should turn around and leave before she saw him. But his feet wouldn't move. And then she looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, the entire world went silent. Her face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She froze, her hand still resting on the curve of her stomach, as if shielding the life inside from the man who had shattered hers. Jae-won couldn't breathe. He'd faced enemies who wanted him dead. He'd stared down men with guns. He'd built an empire on the ability to remain cold, untouchable, unmoved. But standing here, looking at the woman he'd abandoned, pregnant with a child he didn't know existed, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Terror. Not of her. Of himself. Of what he'd done. Sumin, he said, and his voice cracked on her name. She flinched like he'd struck her. Then she turned and walked away. Not quickly. Not running. Just a slow, deliberate retreat. Her hand never leaving her belly. And Jae-won, the man who controlled half the city, who made people disappear with a single word, stood there and let her go. Because he didn't know what else to do. He didn't follow her. Not that day. Jae-won went home to the penthouse he shared with his new wife, poured himself a drink he didn't taste, and stared out at the city lights until dawn. She was pregnant. The thought looped in his mind like a song he couldn't turn off. She was pregnant when I left her. He'd always thought of himself as a man who made calculated decisions, every move deliberate, every risk measured. But now, sitting in the dark with a glass of whiskey warming in his hand. He realized the truth. He hadn't calculated anything. He'd just run from a marriage that felt too quiet, too simple, too normal for a man who lived in shadows and blood. Sumin had never asked him to change. She'd never demanded he leave the organization. She'd just loved him. Steady, patient, unconditional. And somehow that had terrified him more than any rival ever could. So when his mistress whispered poison in his ear, "She doesn't understand you. She doesn't see who you really are," he'd believed it. He'd chosen fire over warmth, chaos over peace. And now Sumin was carrying his child alone. The next morning, Jae-won canceled every meeting on his calendar. Find her, he told his right-hand man, Min-jae, a quiet operative who'd been with him for a decade. Min-jae didn't ask questions. He never did. By noon, Jae-won had an address. A small apartment in a modest neighborhood on the east side. Nothing like the luxury she'd lived in when they were married. No security, no gates, just a plain building with peeling paint and a corner grocery store. He sat in his car across the street for 2 hours, watching the entrance. Pathetic, really. The most feared crime lord in the city, reduced to sitting in a parked sedan like some lovesick fool. But he couldn't help it. He needed to see her again. At 3 p.m. Wanas, she appeared. She walked slowly, one hand on her lower back, the other holding a canvas bag filled with groceries. She wore a simple dress, pale blue, and her braid hung over one shoulder. She looked tired, beautiful, untouchable. Jae-won's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He should get out, walk over, say something. But what could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I left you. I didn't know you were pregnant. I made the biggest mistake of my life. All of it was true. None of it was enough." So he sat there and watched her disappear inside. That night, his new wife asked him where he'd been. "Work," he said. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and didn't press. She never pressed. Because she didn't really care. And for the first time since he'd married her, Jae-won understood what he'd traded. Sumin had cared. She'd cared so much that even when he broke her heart, she never told him about the baby. Because she knew what kind of man he was, and she didn't want her child raised in his world. Jae-won poured another drink. But this time, he didn't drink it. He just stared at the amber liquid and wondered if a man like him could ever deserve forgiveness, or if some mistakes were simply too great to survive. 3 days later, he went back. This time, he didn't sit in the car. This time, he walked up to her door and knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow. Hesitant. The door opened a crack, and Sumin's face appeared in the gap, her eyes widening the moment she saw him. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "I need to talk to you." "No." She tried to close the door, but he put his hand against it. Not pushing, just holding. "Please." She stared at him, her jaw tight, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "You don't get to do this," she said. "You don't get to show up at my door after 8 months and—" "I didn't know." The words came out raw, broken. Sumin's eyes narrowed. "Didn't know what?" "That you were pregnant." He gestured toward her stomach, his hand shaking. "I didn't know." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound. "And if you had known," she asked, "would it have changed anything?" Jae-won opened his mouth, closed it, because he didn't know the answer, and she saw it in his eyes. "That's what I thought," she whispered. She stepped back, and this time, when she closed the door, he didn't stop her. He stood there in the hallway, staring at the faded paint, listening to the sound of her footsteps retreating inside. Then he heard it. A sob. Quiet. Muffled. But unmistakable. Jae-won's chest caved in. He pressed his forehead against the door, his hand flat against the wood. "Sumin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." No response. Just silence. And the faint, heartbreaking sound of the woman he'd destroyed trying not to cry. He stayed there for 10 minutes. Then he left. But as he walked back to his car, something inside him shifted. He'd spent his entire life building an empire, taking what he wanted, destroying what stood in his way. But for the first time, he realized the only thing that had ever mattered was the one thing he'd thrown away. And now he had to figure out if he could fight for it. Not with money, not with power, but with the one thing he'd never given her before. The truth. Jaewon didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed next to his new wife, staring at the ceiling, listening to her steady breathing, and felt like a stranger in his own life. Everything he'd built, the penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the black cars with tinted windows, the men who moved when he nodded, the empire that stretched from the docks to the financial district, all of it felt hollow. Empty, like a beautiful shell with nothing inside. At 4 a.m., and he got up, dressed in the dark, and left. His wife didn't stir. She never did, because she didn't love him either. They'd never pretended otherwise. Their marriage was a transaction, a merger of power. Her family controlled the West Side gambling operations, his controlled everything else. Together, they were untouchable. But standing in the elevator as it descended 40 floors, Jaewon realized something that made his chest tighten. He'd traded a woman who loved him for one who needed him. And there was a difference. A difference he hadn't understood until he saw Soo-min standing in that hospital corridor, carrying his children, looking at him like he was a ghost she'd spent months trying to forget. His driver was waiting in the underground garage. "Where to, sir?" Jaewon stared out at the rows of luxury cars, the pristine concrete, the surveillance cameras mounted in every corner. "The east side," he said quietly. The driver's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. They drove through the empty city streets, past neighborhoods that transformed from glass towers to brick buildings, to modest apartments with laundry hanging on fire escapes. When they reached Soo-min's building, Jaewon told the driver to wait. He sat in the back seat, watching her windows. The lights were off. Of course they were. It was 4:30 in the morning, but he couldn't leave, so he waited. At 6 a.m., her lights came on. Jaewon's heart kicked against his ribs. 20 minutes later, she emerged from the building, moving slowly, one hand on her back. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a simple dress, and her braid was coming loose at the ends. She walked to the bus stop. The woman who used to have a driver, a car, anything she wanted, was taking the bus, because of him, because he'd left her with nothing. Jaewon got out of the car. "Sir," his driver started, but Jaewon was already walking. Soo-min was sitting on the bench, her hands folded over her belly, when his shadow fell across her. She looked up, and froze. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp, defensive. "I wanted to see you." "Well, you've seen me. Now leave." She stood, turning away, but he stepped in front of her. "Please," he said, "just let me talk." "You had 8 months to talk, Jaewon. You chose silence." "Because I'm a coward." The words hung between them. Soo-min's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "That's supposed to make me feel better? That you finally admit you're a coward?" "No." He ran a hand through his hair, his carefully controlled mask cracking. "I don't know what's supposed to make you feel better. I don't know how to fix this. He gestured helplessly at her stomach. "I didn't know. And I know that doesn't change anything. But I need you to hear me say it. I didn't know you were pregnant. If you had, what?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "You would have stayed? You would have loved me again? You would have chosen me over her?" Jaewon flinched, because he still didn't know the answer, and Soo-min saw it. Her expression shifted, from anger to something worse. "Pity. That's what I thought," she whispered. The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes. Soo-min moved past him, stepping onto the bus without looking back. And Jaewon stood there on the sidewalk, watching the bus pull away, feeling like he'd just lost something he could never get back. Again. But this time, he didn't walk away. He got back in his car and followed the bus, through morning traffic, past coffee shops and office buildings and parks where joggers ran in the early light. The bus stopped in front of a small community center. Soo-min got off, moving slowly, and disappeared inside. Jaewon waited 5 minutes. Then he followed. Inside, the building smelled like fresh paint and coffee. There were flyers on the walls, prenatal yoga classes, parenting workshops, support groups for single mothers. Single mothers. The words felt like a knife between his ribs. He found her in a room at the end of the hall. Through the small window in the door, he could see her sitting in a circle with other pregnant women, all of them laughing at something the instructor had said. Sumin's hand rested on her belly, and when she smiled, really smiled, it was like watching the sun come out. And Jae-won realized she was happy. Not perfectly happy. Not the way she used to be. But she was building a life. Without him. And maybe that was what she deserved. He turned to leave, but then he heard her voice, soft and clear through the door. I'm having twins. Jae-won stopped. Twins. Boys. Sumin continued, her voice thick with emotion. I found out last week. The women in the circle gasped, congratulated her, asked questions. And Sumin smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. Their father doesn't know, she said quietly. And I don't think he ever will. One of the women reached over and squeezed her hand. Then he doesn't deserve them, she said firmly. Sumin nodded. But when she looked down at her belly, her expression changed. To something Jae-won recognized. Grief. Not for herself. For her sons. For the father they would never know. Jae-won pressed his fist against the wall, his jaw clenched, his entire body shaking. He'd made a lot of choices in his life, most of them ruthless, some of them necessary. But walking away from Sumin, that wasn't ruthless. It wasn't necessary. It was just wrong. And now she was carrying his sons. His sons. 2 boys who would grow up without knowing their father. Because he'd been too much of a coward to stay. Jae-won left the community center before she saw him. But as he sat in the back seat of his car, staring at nothing, he made a decision. He didn't know if he could fix what he'd broken. He didn't know if Sumin would ever forgive him. But his sons, they deserved better than a father who walked away. And for the first time in his life, Jae-won was going to fight for something that wasn't power. He was going to fight for them. Min-jae was waiting for him when he returned to the office. We have a problem, his right-hand man said without preamble. Jae-won barely looked up from his desk. Handle it. It's the Nakamura Syndicate. They're pushing into our territory on the docks. If we don't respond, I said handle it. Min-jae paused, studying him carefully. Are you all right? Jae-won's jaw tightened. No, he wasn't all right. He was a 32-year-old crime lord who'd just discovered he had twin sons he'd never met, carried by a woman he'd destroyed, and he had no idea how to make any of it right. But he couldn't say that. So instead, he said, I'm fine. Just handle the Nakamura situation, quietly. Min-jae nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered on Jae-won's face for a moment longer than usual. And your wife? He asked carefully. She called earlier, wanted to know if you'd be home for dinner. Jae-won's stomach twisted. Tell her I'll be late. Min-jae left. And Jae-won sat alone in his office, surrounded by the trappings of power. Imported furniture, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city he controlled, and felt like he was suffocating. His phone buzzed. A message from his wife. I made reservations at Aurelio's, 8 p.m., wear the gray suit. He stared at the message, deleted it, then opened a different screen. He'd had Min-jae pull every record he could find on Sumin, bank statements, medical records, employment history. He told himself it was just to make sure she was okay. But really, he just wanted to know her life, the life she was living without him. She was working part-time at a bookstore. A bookstore. Sumin, who had a degree in literature, who used to spend Sunday mornings reading in their apartment with coffee going cold beside her, was working at a bookstore for barely above minimum wage. She had a small savings account, no debt, no help from anyone. She was doing it alone, raising his sons alone, and she was managing. Barely, but managing. Jae-won closed the file, then opened his own financial records. He stared at the numbers, accounts in the Caymans, investments in real estate, offshore holdings that made him one of the wealthiest men in the city, and felt nothing. What was the point of all this money if the only person he wanted to give it to wouldn't take it? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in. One of his men entered, a young operative named Taiho. "Sir, we have confirmation. The Nakamura Syndicate is planning a move tonight. They're bringing in reinforcements from Osaka." Jaewon nodded absently. "Double our presence at the docks. No violence unless they start it." "And Taiho?" "Yes, sir. Make sure it doesn't make the news." Taiho blinked. "Sir?" "I said make sure it doesn't make the news. Handle it quietly. No headlines. No attention." "Understood." The young man left, clearly confused. Jaewon didn't blame him. 6 months ago, he would have made an example of the Nakamura Syndicate. Would have sent a message so loud the entire underworld would hear it. But now? Now he had sons. Sons who would one day be old enough to read the news, to search their father's name online. And he didn't want them to see a monster. He wanted them to see... what? A man who walked away from their mother. A crime lord who built an empire on fear. Jaewon's head dropped into his hands. He didn't know how to be the man his sons needed, but he knew he couldn't keep being the man he was. That night, he didn't go home. He drove to the east side instead, parked across from Sumin's building, and waited. At 9 p.m., her lights were still on. At 10 p.m., he saw her shadow move past the window. At 11 p.m. odd, the lights went out, and Jaewon sat in the dark, staring up at her window, wondering if she was lying awake too, wondering if she ever thought about him, if she hated him, if she missed him, if she'd ever let him be part of their sons' lives. His phone buzzed. His wife. "Where are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he got out of the car and walked to Sumin's building. He stood at the entrance, his hand on the door, his heart pounding. Then he turned around and walked away, because showing up at her door at 11 p.m. wasn't going to fix anything. It would just prove what she already knew, that he was selfish, that he took what he wanted, when he wanted it, that he didn't think about consequences. So instead, Jaewon got back in his car and drove home, to the penthouse, to the wife who didn't love him, to the empire that suddenly meant nothing. But as he rode the elevator up 40 floors, staring at his reflection in the polished doors, he made himself a promise. He was going to find a way to be in his sons' lives, not as the crime lord, not as the man who abandoned their mother, but as their father, even if it killed him, even if it cost him everything. Because for the first time in his life, Jaewon understood. Power wasn't about controlling others. It was about controlling yourself and becoming the man you were supposed to be, even when it was too late. 2 weeks passed. Jaewon didn't contact Sumin, didn't show up at her apartment, didn't follow her to the community center. Instead, he did something he'd never done before. He started preparing. He opened a trust fund in the names of 2 unborn boys. He bought the building Sumin lived in, quietly, through shell companies, and had the entire structure renovated. New plumbing, new heating, security cameras, a coded entry system. She would never know it was him. But at least she'd be safe. He hired a private investigator to make sure no one from his world, or hers, was watching her. And every night, he sat in his office and read parenting books, articles on child development, studies on father-son relationships. He felt ridiculous. A crime lord learning how to be a dad from books written by suburban therapists. But he didn't know what else to do. Min-jae noticed. "You've been different," his right-hand man said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of Jaewon's office. Jaewon looked up from a spreadsheet, though his mind had been miles away. Different how? Quieter. Distracted. Min-jae paused, choosing his words carefully. Is it her? Jaewon didn't ask who he meant. He didn't need to. "Yeah," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. Min-jae stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He'd worked for Jaewon for a decade, had seen him order men eliminated with a single nod, had watched him negotiate deals that shifted millions of dollars with a handshake, had never once seen him hesitate. Until now. "You ever think about telling her the truth?" Min-jae asked. Jaewon's fingers stilled on the keyboard. What truth? That you're in love with her. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jaewon's jaw tightened. "I'm not..." "Yes, you are." Minjai's voice was calm, matter of fact. You always have been. You just didn't know how to live with it. Jae-won stared at him, his throat tight. Because it was true. He'd loved Soo-min from the moment he met her. She'd been working at a university library, shelving books with her hair falling out of a messy bun, completely absorbed in reading the back cover of a novel she'd just discovered. She hadn't known who he was, hadn't cared about his reputation, his power, his name. She'd just looked at him, really looked at him, and smiled. And for the first time in his life, Jae-won had felt seen, not as the heir to a criminal empire, not as a weapon his father had forged, just as a man. They'd married 6 months later, and for 3 years, she'd been the only peace he'd ever known. But peace had terrified him, because men like him didn't deserve peace. Men like him deserved exactly what they built. Empires of fear, relationships of convenience, lives measured in power instead of love. So when his mistress had whispered in his ear, "She's too good for you. She'll leave eventually. Better to leave first." He'd believed it. He'd walked away, and he'd been running ever since. And now? Jae-won asked quietly, his voice rough. What am I supposed to do now? Min-jae's expression softened. Now you have to decide if you're brave enough to try. The decision was made for him 3 days later. Jae-won was in a meeting with his financial advisors, barely listening as they discussed quarterly projections and offshore investments. His mind kept drifting to Soo-min, wondering if she was at the bookstore, if she was tired, if the babies were moving, if she ever thought about him. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. But something, instinct, intuition, fate, made him pick up. Yes? Silence. Then a voice he'd know anywhere, even in his sleep, even across years and distance and all the ways he'd tried to forget. Jae-won. His entire body went rigid, every muscle locked, every nerve fired. Soo-min. Her voice was tight, strained, barely holding together. I need help. His heart stopped. Completely stopped. Then slammed back to life, racing so fast he could barely breathe. What's wrong? Are you hurt? Are the babies? I'm at the hospital. Her voice cracked, and he could hear her fighting tears. There were complications. They're saying I might need an emergency C-section and I don't have anyone. And I know I shouldn't have called, but She broke off, and Jae-won was already moving. He stood so fast his chair crashed backward. His advisors jumped, startled. But he didn't care. Which hospital? Seoul General, but you don't have to. I'm on my way. He hung up, grabbed his coat. His hands were shaking. His hands were shaking. Jae-won, who'd stared down rival bosses without flinching, who'd negotiated hostage situations with a smile, who'd built a reputation on being untouchable, his hands were shaking. Cancel everything, he told Min-jae, his voice hard and sharp. I don't care what it is. I don't care who it's with. Cancel it. What's happening? Soo-min's in the hospital. The babies. His voice broke. I have to go. Min-jae's eyes widened, but he just nodded, already pulling out his phone. Go, he said firmly. I'll handle everything here. Jae-won ran. He didn't walk. Didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs, his shoes pounding against concrete, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. What if she loses them? What if something happens to her? What if I'm too late? He burst out into the parking garage, his driver already running toward the car, keys in hand. Seoul General! Jae-won barked, yanking open the door. Now, don't stop for anything. The driver nodded, and the car screamed out of the garage. They made the 20-minute drive in 12. The driver ran red lights. Jae-won didn't even notice. He sat in the back seat, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white, his jaw locked, his entire body vibrating with an emotion he couldn't name. Terror. Not the kind that came from violence or threats. The kind that came from realizing you were about to lose the only thing that mattered. When they screeched to a stop in front of the emergency entrance, he was out of the car before it fully stopped. He ran through the automatic doors, his shoes echoing on the linoleum, his heart slamming against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. Soo-min? He gasped at the reception desk, his voice barely recognizable. She's pregnant. Complications. Where is she? The nurse looked up, startled by the raw desperation in his voice. Name? Kim Soo-min. The nurse typed quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Every second felt like an eternity. 4th floor, maternity ward, room 427. Jae-won didn't wait for directions, didn't say thank you. He just ran. To the elevators, jabbed the button, watched the numbers crawl upward. 1, 2, 3, too slow. He gave up and took the stairs. 4th floor. His lungs burned. His legs ached. He didn't care. Room 427. The door was closed. He burst through it and froze. Soo-min was sitting up in bed, her face pale, her hands clutching the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She looked so small, so fragile, so scared. A doctor stood beside her, speaking in low, calm tones, explaining something about heart rates and monitoring and potential interventions. But when Soo-min saw Jae-won, her entire expression crumpled. Relief, fear, hope, all of it crashing together. You came, she whispered, her voice breaking. And Jae-won crossed the room in 3 strides. He didn't think, didn't plan. He just dropped to his knees beside her bed and took her hand in both of his. Her skin was cold, trembling. I'm here, he said, his voice rough and raw. I'm here. You're not alone. Soo-min's eyes filled with tears. Fat, heavy drops that spilled down her cheeks. They said the baby's heart rates dropped, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. They're monitoring them. But if it happens again, if they can't stabilize, it won't, Jae-won said fiercely, squeezing her hand. It won't. You're strong. They're strong. You're all going to be fine. He said it with such conviction that for a moment, even he believed it. The doctor cleared his throat. Mr. Kim, Jae-won said automatically, not taking his eyes off Soo-min. I'm her husband. Soo-min's eyes widened. Her lips parted in surprise, but she didn't correct him. The doctor nodded, accepting it without question. We're going to keep monitoring the situation closely, he explained. If the heart rates stabilize over the next few hours, we can avoid surgery. But if they drop again, we'll need to move quickly. We're preparing the OR just in case. Do whatever you need to do, Jae-won said, his voice hard and commanding. Money is not an issue. Get the best team, the best equipment, whatever she needs, whatever they need. The doctor blinked, clearly taken aback by the intensity, then nodded. Of course. We'll take excellent care of her. He left, closing the door softly behind him. And suddenly, it was just the two of them. Jae-won stayed on his knees beside her bed, still holding her hand like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Soo-min stared at him, her eyes red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears. You didn't have to come, she said softly. Yes, I did. Why? The question hung between them. Jae-won looked up at her, and for the first time in 8 months, he told her the truth, the whole truth. Because they're my sons, he said, his voice breaking on the words. And you're... He swallowed hard, his throat tight. You're the only person I've ever loved. Soo-min's breath caught. A small, sharp sound. Jae-won, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he continued, the words pouring out now, unstoppable. I know I broke everything. I know I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand. But I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to let me be here. For them. For you. Please. His voice cracked on the last word. Tears spilled down Soo-min's cheeks, faster now, her shoulders shaking. You left me, she whispered. You looked me in the eye and said you didn't love me anymore. I lied. You married someone else. I know. You built a whole new life without me. I know. Jae-won's grip on her hand tightened, and I've regretted it every single day since. Every morning I wake up and remember what I did. Every night I lie awake and hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you. His voice broke completely. I just want to be here. For our sons. Please. Soo-min closed her eyes, fresh tears sliding down her face. For a long moment, she said nothing. Jaewon waited, his heart in his throat, barely breathing. Then, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Okay." Jaewon's chest caved in with relief. A sound escaped him, half sob, half breath. He pressed his forehead against their joined hands and closed his eyes, his entire body shaking. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Sumin didn't say anything else. She just let him hold her hand, and somehow that was enough. The next 3 hours were the longest of Jaewon's life. He stayed beside her bed, refusing to leave even when the nurses came to check her vitals, even when they asked him to step out for examinations. He just stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Sumin's face. She dozed on and off, exhausted from stress and fear. Every time she stirred, he was there. "I'm here," he'd say softly. "Rest." And she would, because for the first time in 8 months, she didn't have to carry everything alone. At one point, a nurse brought him coffee. "You should eat something," she said kindly. "There's a cafeteria on the 2nd floor." "I'm fine." "Sir, you've been here for hours." "I said I'm fine." The nurse retreated. Jaewon didn't care if he was being rude. He wasn't leaving. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from his wife, from his advisors, from Min-jae with updates on business that suddenly felt completely irrelevant. He ignored all of them. Around hour 2, Sumin woke up and looked at him. "You're still here?" she said, surprised. "I told you I wasn't leaving." "Your wife." "Doesn't matter." Sumin's eyes widened. "Jaewon?" "She doesn't matter," he repeated, his voice firm. "Not compared to this. Not compared to you." Sumin looked away, her jaw tight. "You can't just say things like that." "Why not? It's true." "Because it's not fair." Her voice rose slightly, emotion bleeding through. "You don't get to walk away, build a whole new life, and then show up here and say I matter. You don't get to do that." "You're right," Jaewon said quietly. "I don't. But I'm here anyway. And I'm not going anywhere." Sumin stared at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Truth, lies, hope. She didn't know. Then she turned away. But she didn't let go of his hand. Around hour 3, the doctor returned. Jaewon stood immediately, his entire body tense. "The babies?" he asked, his voice sharp. The doctor smiled. "Stable. Heart rates have normalized. We're going to keep monitoring, but I think we've avoided surgery for now." The relief that flooded through Jaewon was so intense, he had to grip the edge of the bed to stay standing. "They're okay?" Sumin asked, her voice trembling. "They're okay," the doctor confirmed. "But you'll need to stay in the hospital for observation. At least overnight, possibly longer. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again." Sumin nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. The doctor squeezed her shoulder gently, then left, and Sumin covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Jaewon didn't hesitate. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms. She stiffened at first, then collapsed against him, her face buried in his chest, her entire body shaking with relief and fear and exhaustion. "They're okay," she kept saying. "They're okay. They're okay," Jaewon echoed, his arms tight around her. "You're all okay." He pressed his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of her, jasmine and something uniquely her, and felt something inside him break open. All the walls he'd built, all the distance he'd created, all the lies he'd told himself. Gone. He loved her. He'd always loved her. And he'd been a coward for walking away. They stayed like that for a long time, until Sumin's sobs quieted, until her breathing evened out, until she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't," Jaewon said firmly. "Don't apologize." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and puffy. And she was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "I shouldn't have called you," she said softly. "I'm glad you did." "Why?" "Because I want to be here. I need to be here." Sumin shook her head slowly. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to let you back in." Then don't, Jae-won said. Don't let me back in. Just let me be here. For them. That's all I'm asking. Soo-min's eyes filled with fresh tears. And if I can't? Jae-won's chest tightened, but he forced himself to say the words. Then I'll respect that. But I'll still be here. In whatever way you'll let me. Soo-min stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. Jae-won exhaled, relief flooding through him again. Okay. That night, visiting hours ended. The nurses told him he had to leave. Jae-won looked at Soo-min. She was lying back against the pillows, exhausted, one hand resting on her belly. I'll be back first thing in the morning, he said. She nodded, but as he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Jae-won? He turned back. Thank you, she said softly. For coming. His throat tightened. Always, he said. Then he left. But he didn't go home. He went to his car and sat in the parking lot, staring up at the fourth-floor windows, at the light glowing in room 427, at the place where the woman he loved and the sons he'd never met were sleeping. And for the first time in 8 months, Jae-won felt like he had a purpose. Not power, not empire, just them. He must have dozed off, because he woke to knocking on his window. Min-jae stood outside, holding 2 cups of coffee. Jae-won rolled down the window. What are you doing here? Making sure you don't do anything stupid, Min-jae said, handing him a coffee. Like sleep in a parking lot. Jae-won took the cup, but didn't drink. She's okay, he said quietly. The babies are okay. Min-jae nodded. Good. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Min-jae said, Your wife is looking for you. Jae-won's jaw tightened. I don't care. She's threatening to call your father. Let her. Min-jae raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Jae-won looked up at the 4th-floor window, at the light still glowing. Yeah, he said. I'm sure. Because his father could threaten him, his wife could divorce him. His entire empire could crumble. And it wouldn't matter. Not compared to the 2 boys growing inside Soo-min. Not compared to the woman who'd just let him back into her life, even if only at the edges. Go home, Min-jae said quietly. Get some sleep. I'll have someone watch the hospital tonight. I'm not leaving. Jae-won, I said I'm not leaving. Min-jae sighed, but he didn't argue. He just got into the passenger seat. Then I'm staying too. Jae-won looked at him. You don't have to. I know. Min-jae leaned back. But someone needs to make sure you actually eat something. And knowing you, you'll just sit here all night staring at windows like some lovesick teenager. Despite everything, Jae-won almost smiled. Thanks. Don't mention it. They sat in comfortable silence. And Jae-won looked up at the window where Soo-min was sleeping, where his sons were growing, where his entire world now lived. But across the city, in a dark office overlooking the harbor, someone else was watching. A man sat behind a mahogany desk, studying photographs spread across the surface. Jae-won entering the hospital. Jae-won kneeling beside a hospital bed. Jae-won holding a pregnant woman's hand. The man smiled. Slow. Predatory. So, he murmured, picking up one of the photos. The crime lord has a heart after all. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. For years he'd been looking for Jae-won's weakness. Some way to hurt him, to bring him down, to take everything he'd built. And now finally he had it. A pregnant ex-wife, 2 unborn sons. The perfect leverage. He picked up his phone and dialed. It's me, he said when someone answered. I have a job for you. A pause. No, nothing violent. Not yet. I just need you to watch someone. A woman. Pregnant. Lives on the east side. Another pause. Because she matters to Jae-won. And anything that matters to him is worth exploiting. He hung up, then looked at the photo again. At Jae-won's face, twisted with emotion, vulnerable in a way he'd never been before. Enjoy your happiness while it lasts, the man whispered. Because it won't. He set the photo down, and began to plan. Back at the hospital, Soo-min woke suddenly. A nightmare. She couldn't remember what it was about, but her heart was racing. her hands shaking. She reached for the call button. But then she saw him. Through the window in her door. J1. Sitting in a chair in the hallway, his head tilted back against the wall, his eyes closed. He'd stayed, even after visiting hours. Even after she'd told him she didn't know how to let him back in. He'd stayed. Sumin's throat tightened. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of her sons. His sons. And for the first time in 8 months, she let herself feel it. Not anger, not hurt, just hope, fragile, terrifying, but real. "What am I supposed to do with you?" she whispered, looking at J1's sleeping form through the window. He didn't hear her, but somehow, she felt like he would have answered anyway. "Let me try. Just let me try." And maybe, just maybe, she would. J1 thought staying away would keep them safe. But now that the secret is out, every enemy he's ever made knows exactly how to hurt him. And when men in dark cars start following Sumin, when threats are whispered in shadows, when his past comes for his future, he'll have to make an impossible choice. His empire. Or his family. Because in his world, you can't protect both. And the people who want him destroyed, they're just getting started. The clock is ticking. And this time, love might not be enough to save them.